Most people think this story is about Venezuela. Some think it's about Donald Trump. Almost everyone thinks it's about Nicolas Maduro being dragged out of power. They're wrong. When US forces seized Maduro, the real shockwave didn't stop in Caracas. It traveled quietly to Moscow, and it landed squarely on Vladimir Putin's desk, because the danger for Putin isn't the loss of an ally. It's not the embarrassment of a failed partnership. It's something far more structural, something that could hit the foundations of Russian power itself. Two questions now dominate the Kremlin's thinking. Questions no one can yet answer, and questions that matter more than any speech about sovereignty or international law. If you want to understand how power really works in the world and why some leaders fear silence more than sanctions, stay with me. Because to see the full picture, we have to step back and define the problem first. To understand why this moment matters, we need to be precise about what is actually at stake. For Russia, Venezuela was never just a distant partner. It was a node, a strategic intersection of energy, arms sales, finance, and narrative power, a place where Moscow could project relevance far beyond its immediate neighborhood. So when Washington moved militarily, the immediate debate focused on visible gains and losses, diplomatic optics, broken investments, abandoned loans, a weakened client state. But that framing misses the deeper issue. Putin is not calculating this crisis the way commentators do. He is not asking whether Russia won or lost in Venezuela. He is asking whether the rules of the system are shifting quietly, decisively, and against him. Because if the United States is redefining how it uses power through energy markets and enforcement at sea, then Venezuela is not an exception. It's a test case. And once you see it that way, the question stops being about Latin America. It becomes about how this story began. To see why Venezuela mattered to Moscow in the first place, you have to rewind the clock. For more than 2 decades, Russia has used energy as both an economic engine and a geopolitical tool. Oil revenues financed the state, energy partnerships bought influence, and isolated producers became entry points into new regions. Venezuela fit perfectly into that logic. As Western pressure mounted on Caracas, Moscow stepped in, investing in oil projects, extending loans, selling weapons, embedding itself into energy infrastructure, not because Venezuela was profitable, but because it was strategic. This was a familiar cycle. Find a sanctioned state, offer capital and protection, extract leverage, economic, political, symbolic. Over time, these relationships fed a broader narrative. Russia as leader of a global majority. Russia as proof that American power could be resisted. But cycles end, and when markets soften and enforcement tightens, leverage turns into liability. That moment arrived in Caracas. The first crisis arrived quietly, but its meaning was unmistakable. With Maduro gone, Russia's long-standing investments in Venezuela's oil sector lost their political shield overnight. Projects built over 20 years didn't collapse spectacularly. They simply stopped mattering. Assets once meant to generate influence now demanded write-offs. Loans for weapons purchases turned into dead paper. And the symbolism was harsh. Russian arms failed to deter anything. That mattered more than the money, because reputation is currency in geopolitics, and this episode devalued it. Even trade, modest but meaningful, began to evaporate. So did Venezuela's role as an energy lifeline for partners like Cuba, where Russia had cultivated influence patiently. From afar, these losses look manageable. Russia has survived worse. But crises aren't defined by size, they're defined by what they expose, and this one exposed vulnerability. If this analysis is sharpening how you see power, pause and stay engaged, because what lies beneath is far more dangerous. What truly unsettles Moscow is not what has already been lost, but what might now be exposed. For years, Russia relied on systems operating below the surface of formal power, not treaties, not alliances, mechanisms. Two of the most important are oil pricing and the shadow fleet, tankers quietly moving Russian crude, skirting sanctions, sustaining the state. These mechanisms function only under specific assumptions, enforcement gaps, predictable hesitation, a divided West. The Caracas operation threatens all three. If Washington treats energy not as a market outcome but as a strategic weapon, the rules change. Oil becomes leverage, and if pressure expands into inspections or seizures, the shadow fleet stops being invisible. Putin's concern is systemic because systems don't collapse dramatically. They fail when assumptions break silently, and once they do, leaders stop shaping events and start reacting. That leads directly to the second crisis. The second crisis is more dangerous because it hasn't fully surfaced yet. It begins at sea. If U.S. actions around Venezuela spill outward into tanker inspections or seizures, the implications multiply fast. What starts as a regional operation becomes precedent, and precedent is how power hardens. For now, U.S. pressure on Russia over Ukraine has been limited, enough to signal disapproval, not enough to force change. But the shadow fleet links energy to war. Energy funds the state sustains the war, disrupt the flow, and Ukraine is affected. That is what Putin must fear, because if Venezuela enforcement evolves into broader activism and Western unity reconsolidates, the strategic equation shifts overnight. Trump's words hinted this instability. I'm not thrilled with Putin. Leaders don't fear statements. They fear trajectories. This crisis doesn't explode. It accelerates. This is where it stops being abstract and starts touching you. When oil prices fall and shipping tightens, consequences don't stay in briefing rooms. They move downward into wages, into prices. If your country depends on energy exports, volatility isn't theoretical. It reshapes budgets. It shrinks promises. It narrows futures. And here's the truth most people never hear. You don't choose these risks. You inherit them. You don't choose shadow fleets or geopolitical gambits, but you live with their outcomes. That's why understanding power matters. Not for cynicism, but for clarity. If this perspective is changing how you see the world, don't let it pass. Share it, stay engaged, because pressure never stops at borders. When pressure scales, it rarely stays contained. Energy markets are global. A disruption in one corridor ripples outward. Prices react before policies. States adjust faster than narratives. If U.S. actions affect Russian exports, even indirectly, the signal spreads. Producers hedge. Importers diversify. Governments rethink dependence on suppliers operating in legal gray zones. This is how geopolitics becomes structural. An action meant for one hemisphere reorganizes power far beyond it. Observers across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East take notes not on ideology but enforcement. For Russia, that's the danger. Influence built on energy weakens when buyers sense instability, and trust once lost rarely returns, which brings us to the future. From here, three futures diverge. The first is controlled adjustment. Oil prices dip but stabilize. Enforcement stays selective. Russia absorbs losses and adapts quietly. The system bends. The second is prolonged pressure. Revenues slide. Shadow shipping grows riskier. Western coordination tightens slowly. Friction accumulates. Options narrow. The third is escalation. Oil becomes an explicit weapon. Seizures expand. Markets react sharply. Enforcement spreads across theaters. History suggests systems don't choose extremes deliberately. They drift into them. Putin understands that the most dangerous moments aren't announced. They're locked in. That uncertainty is what he's watching now. What this moment reveals is not morality but mechanics. Power doesn't announce itself, it tests, it probes, it watches responses. Putin's real worry isn't Trump or Venezuela. It's whether energy, enforcement, and unity are being recombined into a system with less room to maneuver. Once that system hardens, speeches stop mattering. Narratives fade. Leverage evaporates. For you, the lesson is simple. The world isn't shaped by events, but by how events connect: oil to shipping, shipping to war, war to daily life. If you only follow headlines, you miss the structure underneath, and that's where real change happens. So don't watch this as spectacle. Track it as architecture. Stay here, share this, because when pressure finally breaks something, you'll want to already see it coming.